I've been considering switching to single file components in Angular for a while now, and I've finally decided to do it. So to quickly explain what a single file component is, it's just the idea of defining your styles and template inline in your component like this. Whereas perhaps the more common and I guess default approach is to have the template link out to a separate file and the styles as well. So rather than having multiple different files that define a component, we just have the one component file. And if you have testing files as well, that's going to live alongside that. So if you haven't done this, it might feel a little bit weird just putting your whole template in the component metadata like this, but if you've got the Angular language service installed, then you're going to get all of your usual syntax highlighting that you would expect. So creating your templates here isn't really awkward or anything like that. And I'll also show you a little VS Code extension I just published to help with single file components a little later in the video. So using single file components also typically means defining your ng module inline as well in that same file, which I'm doing here. But with the move to standalone components in Angular 14, this will no longer be necessary, at least if you're using standalone components. The only reason I'm still doing this here is because the support for standalone components hasn't quite landed in Ionic yet, which is what I'm primarily using with Angular. So to give us something to look at as an example, I've refactored one of my existing applications to use this single file component structure. This is actually an application we've looked at before briefly in my other video about the complex RxJS stream and operators. So I'll link to that video if you want to check that out. But we're just going to focus on the broad architecture here. So if we just have a bit of a click around, we can get a sense of what this looks like. This settings component here is a pretty good example of what a typical inline component might look like. I can open up, say, a settings form here. Again, similar sort of thing. We have some pretty simple presentational components like this, but we do also have some more complex smart components as well. If I open up my home component, for example, this is a smart component with a little bit more going on in it. So this file's, quite a bit larger than the other ones we were looking at. So in general, we are going to have more stuff in this one file because it is holding everything that would have otherwise been split over multiple files. Okay, so let's talk about why anyone would want to do this, and more specifically, why I have decided to switch to single file components. I think a lot of people probably have a pretty visceral initial reaction to this. That's something like, ooh, I hate it. Why have everything neatly organized into 3 separate files based on their role when we can just have one giant chaotic file? And to be completely honest with you, probably the biggest thing that drew me to this approach initially was its growing popularity among the Angular developers I follow on Twitter. It was the new cool thing, which isn't a great reason to justify some approach, but the idea of using something fun and new and different that's still Angular does appeal to me after many years of doing things the same way. I am kind of drawn to anything that makes Angular feel more modern. And again, I don't think this is a good reason. I'm just being open about the fact that, joining in with the cool kids was at least some of the appeal of this approach, at least initially. So although that was part of what drew me in, I do have actual legitimate reasons for wanting to use this approach. So let's start with one of the most common rebuttals I see to the single file component approach, which is separation of concerns. The idea that putting everything in one file violates the principle of separation of concerns. So I don't want to say that that view is wrong, this is just my opinion, but I don't think separating the template styles and class into separate files is separating concerns or better adhering to the single responsibility principle. In my view, it is the component as a whole that has the responsibility or concern. Ideally, one component should be responsible for one thing. And whether the template and styles live in separate files or in the component metadata doesn't really change the responsibilities of the component. In any case, even if the templates and styles are in the same file, they are still separated. The templates live within the template property, and the styles live within the styles property as well. These are their spots. This is their isolated little zone that they have. It just happens to be in this one file. So I don't think we are losing anything in terms of separation of concerns here. And that brings me to my point. I actually think single file components can have the opposite effect I think they can increase separation of concerns and adherence to the single responsibility principle. So with everything in one file, you are constantly aware of how big the component is becoming. And you might be more inclined to break things up into smaller parts than you would if things were separated out into 3 separate files. In a sense, separating it out into 3 separate files just probably makes it look 3 times simpler than it actually is. So if we take a look at this search bar component I have here, for example, this is super nice to look at, I think, and everything is right here. It's small, modular, easier to understand quickly. It has a single concern. It's just setting up a search bar input. So it has everything, I think, that makes this a nice, small, modular component. So now let's go back to that smart component, the home component, for something that is a little bit more complex. So this file is still a reasonable size, I think, but it's harder to take it all in at once. We're at about 150 lines now, so there is a bit of scrolling around required to see everything. And I typically like to navigate around my project with the keyboard, so I might just scroll up and down like this, or I have a line jumper extension installed so I can sort of jump 10 lines at a time. But with a big file like this, it is significantly harder to quickly see everything than it was, say, with having multiple files where I could just jump backwards and forwards like this and quickly snap between different sections. So I actually created this little VS Code extension so you can easily jump between the different parts of the inline component with a keyboard shortcut. So if I hit Option T, that's going to take me straight to the template. Option S is going to take me to the styles. And then if I hit Option C, we are going to get taken to the class. So I can pretty quickly just jump between the template, class, and styles. So I'll link to that in the description for you to download if you want to check it out. It's called Angular Inline Jumper. And at least in my view, using this extension is basically, we're back at the same point where we're sort of jumping between files. We're just jumping within that file instead. But my point is, though, that we can always see all at once how complex our component is becoming, and breaking up components into more modular parts is probably going to happen sooner with this single file component, because it is much more obvious that it's getting complex. And then that is probably going to improve the separation of concerns and the single responsibility principle within our application. This component is probably on the edge of, what I would consider reasonable. And at this point, I might even be thinking, say, for example, this header component, I might want to pull that out into its own UI DOM component, and then I could just plop the header in here as a single tag. But if this template wasn't in this file, if I just delete this, for example, it becomes a lot simpler and it doesn't seem like much of a problem. So I'm going to be less inclined to, optimize that and make it into smaller components. Okay, so I think that using single file components is more likely to improve the architecture of the application, but now let's get into my main reason for switching to this approach. And the main reason is that I just like the way it feels. Having everything in one file just feels simple and nice, and perhaps more importantly, I find myself just coding without having to rely on the CLI and generators so much. So if we have 4 files for a component, it's a bit annoying to have to manually create all of those. So using the CLI makes a lot of sense here. We can just run a generate command and we get everything we need. And the CLI is great, but as small of a context switch as it is, I do feel like stopping to generate a component pulls me out of the flow a bit. So rather than using the CLI, what I find myself doing when I'm using single file components is just creating new files manually. So I just mentioned before about potentially creating a header component, for example. So let's say I create a new header component under the UI folder here. So what I'm going to do is just create that header.component.ts file. And I'm just going to start filling stuff in with autocomplete. If I just start writing component, I can get that to auto import from Angular Core. And then I can just start filling in the details I want for this. And I can jump in, and if I want, I can just start, creating my template at this point. I can use Emmet in here as well, so I can pretty quickly get a template defined. So we get one with the ion header, ion toolbar, ion title, for example. So I can very quickly get things set up without having to sort of break that flow and, jump into the command line, wait for it to generate the component. Again, it's a very small thing. It's not hard to just bring this up and run a generate command, but I feel like I'm just sort of keeping that same context. So I feel like this has two main benefits. One is that, as I just mentioned, I feel more in the flow and in control of everything if I don't have to bust out the CLI to do something for me. And although I understand how components and other decorated classes work quite well now, for the longest time I just relied on the CLI to get everything set up for me. And I found that actually writing all of these configurations out myself made me feel a lot more confident in my ability to write and understand Angular code. If you've just been using the CLI, maybe if you try to write out a component decorator, for example, you might just be completely lost, even if you've done it hundreds of times. So one thing I do not intend to write out myself each time, though, is testbed configurations for my spec files. So it's kind of annoying that I have to sully my beautiful one file setup here with a separate spec file, but what I have been doing is also just manually creating this spec file. So I'll create a header.component.spec.ts file, and then I just have this little snippet set up that will just drop in all of the configuration I need for that spec file, and I'm just going to have to come through and change its name from, say, home component to header component. So again, super fast, maybe or maybe not faster than using the CLI, but again, I feel like it keeps me in the flow more. So those were my main reasons for using this single file component approach, which mostly just amounts to I just like the way it feels. At least in my opinion, I don't think there's a super strong reason that everyone should be doing this. So if you don't like it, don't use it. But if you don't like it at the moment, maybe just give it a go because I didn't like the approach either. And now I really like it. So maybe you will too. As I said, I think maybe there is some architectural benefits there in terms of helping you see the complexity of your component and maybe refactoring those out more quickly and not hiding the complexity of your components. But again, I think it's a pretty small benefit. So I haven't been using this approach for that long, so maybe my opinion will evolve further, but I'm pretty sure this is what I'll be doing from now on, especially once I'm able to use standalone components with Ionic. My general sense of the Angular community is that there is some resistance to single file components and standalone components, so I'd love to hear what you think, whether you're for or against this approach or whether you're willing to give it a go. So whichever side you're on, I hope you have a great day. If you like my content, feel free to like or subscribe before you leave, and I hope to catch you in the next video.